Jake Thompson had been the invisible new kid for exactly 3 weeks when Derek Mitchell decided to make him famous in the worst possible way. What started as typical high school bullying in the Lincoln High gymnasium would explode into a viral moment that nobody saw coming. Because Derek and his crew had no idea that the quiet military kid they were about to humiliate had been trained since childhood by one of America's most elite fighting forces. The shirt-ripping incident lasted less than 10 seconds. The aftermath would change everything at Lincoln High forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog rolled off the Pacific coast as Jake Thompson pulled his beat-up Honda Civic into the student parking lot of Lincoln High School. At 17, he'd attended more schools than most kids his age could count on both hands. But something about Riverside, California felt different. Maybe it was the way the morning sun cut through the marine layer, or how the distant mountains framed the sprawling campus of 2,800 students. More likely, it was because his father had promised this would be their last move before Jake graduated. Master Chief Petty Officer Mike Thompson was currently deployed somewhere in the Middle East that Jake wasn't allowed to know about, conducting operations he wasn't allowed to discuss. The familiar weight of secrecy sat heavy on Jake's shoulders as he grabbed his worn backpack and headed toward the main building. His mother, Sarah, had taken a job as a nurse at the local VA hospital, and for the first time in years, they were staying put long enough for Jake to maybe, just maybe, finish high school in one place. Lincoln High sprawled across 40 acres of California landscape, a massive public institution that served both the military families from nearby Camp Pendleton and the affluent civilian population of Riverside. The contrast was stark and immediate. In the student parking lot, rusted pickup trucks with military base stickers sat next to brand-new BMW convertibles. Kids in thrift store clothes walked alongside others wearing designer outfits that cost more than some families spent on groceries in a month. Jake fit solidly into the first category. His jeans were clean but faded, his t-shirt was plain navy blue from a 3-pack at Target, and his sneakers had seen better days. Everything about his appearance screamed temporary military kid to anyone paying attention. He'd learned over the years that blending in meant survival, that drawing attention in a new school usually led to complications he didn't need. The morning routine was always the same regardless of which school he attended. First, locate the main office and confirm his schedule. Second, identify the safest routes between classes. Third, find the quietest spots to eat lunch. Fourth, keep his head down and count the days until graduation. At Lincoln High, graduation was still 8 months away, which felt both impossibly long and surprisingly hopeful. The main hallway stretched nearly 200 feet from the front entrance to the back exit, lined with blue and gold banners celebrating decades of Lincoln High achievements. Football dominated the display cases, with championship trophies dating back to the 1970s, creating a shrine to athletic excellence. The current team photos showed the same confident faces Jake had observed in every football-obsessed town his family had lived in. Young men who carried themselves like kings because their community treated them exactly that way. As Jake walked toward his first period American history class, he noticed the subtle but unmistakable social geography that existed in every high school hallway. The football players clustered near the trophy cases, their letterman jackets like badges of nobility. The cheerleaders occupied the prime real estate by the main office, perfectly positioned to be seen by everyone entering the building. Academic achievers gathered near classroom doors, clutching textbooks and discussing homework with serious expressions. The various other tribes scattered throughout the remaining space. Each group unconsciously maintained territorial boundaries that had probably existed since the school opened. Jake belonged to none of these groups, which suited him perfectly. Invisibility had become his superpower over the years, refined through constant practice at new schools across the country. He'd mastered the art of being present but unnoticed, engaged but not memorable, friendly but not close enough to anyone to make leaving difficult. His first period teacher, Mrs. Patterson, barely glanced up when he entered the classroom 5 minutes early. She was a veteran educator in her 50s who'd probably seen hundreds of military kids cycle through her classes over the years. Jake chose a desk in the third row, not so far back that he looked disengaged, not so far forward that he appeared overeager. The perfect middle ground that had served him well in 17 different schools. Other students began filtering in as the warning bell approached, and Jake observed them with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to quickly assess new social environments. The girl with the highlighted hair and designer purse was clearly part of the popular crowd. The boy with the thick glasses and advanced calculus textbook was obviously focused on academics. The group of kids discussing weekend plans in hushed tones had the comfortable familiarity of long-term friendships. One student caught Jake's attention more than the others. Maria Santos entered the classroom with purpose, carrying a worn leather messenger bag and scanning the room with intelligent dark eyes. She had the air of someone who noticed things, who paid attention to details that others missed. When her gaze briefly met Jake's, he saw curiosity rather than the typical indifference. Most students showed toward new faces. The morning announcements crackled through the ancient PA system, dominated by updates about the upcoming football playoff game against Central Valley High. The excitement in Principal Hayes' voice was unmistakable as she reminded everyone about the rally scheduled for Friday afternoon. Football wasn't just important at Lincoln High. It was practically a religious experience that unified the entire community. Jake's schedule was typical for a junior with decent grades and no particular academic focus. American history, followed by chemistry, then English literature, lunch, pay, trigonometry, and finally, art as an elective his counselor had suggested to round out his transcript. The classes blended together in familiar patterns of note-taking, assignment collection, and teacher introductions that always included the phrase, "We have a new student joining us today." By fourth period lunch, Jake had successfully navigated his first morning without incident. The cafeteria presented its own unique challenges, a massive space that could seat nearly 800 students, and showcased the school's social hierarchy in brutal clarity. The football team occupied the prime tables near the windows, their voices carrying across the room as they discussed plays and strategy. The popular girls commanded the center tables, perfectly positioned to observe and judge everyone around them. Various other groups claimed their traditional territories, while newcomers and social outcasts settled for whatever space remained. Jake purchased a sandwich and chips from the lunch line, then surveyed the seating options with military precision. His father had taught him to always assess his environment, identify potential threats and safe zones, plan multiple exit strategies. It was a habit that had served him well in unfamiliar social situations, even if the threats were more about embarrassment than physical danger. He settled at a half-empty table near the back wall, close enough to a side exit that he could leave quickly if needed. The conversation around him was typical high school fare. Discussions about weekend plans, complaints about teachers, gossip about relationships and breakups. Jake ate his lunch in comfortable silence, observing the complex social dynamics playing out around him. That's when he first noticed Derek Mitchell in action. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The senior quarterback was holding court at the center football table, his voice carrying easily across the crowded cafeteria. Derek stood 6 feet 3 inches tall with the kind of natural athleticism that made college recruiters take notice. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, his clothing expensive but casual, his entire presence radiating the confidence of someone who'd never faced a challenge he couldn't overcome. Derek was telling a story about the previous weekend's party, describing in exaggerated detail how he'd convinced some underclassmen to jump off a roof into a swimming pool. The way he told it, with dramatic gestures and perfectly timed pauses, made it clear he was as skilled at commanding attention as he was at throwing touchdown passes. His audience of teammates and admirers laughed at all the right moments, feeding his obvious need for validation and control. But Jake noticed something else in Derek's performance, something his father had taught him to recognize in potential adversaries. Beneath the charismatic exterior was a calculating intelligence that constantly assessed everyone around him, categorizing people as either useful allies or potential threats. Derek's eyes swept the cafeteria regularly, taking inventory of his domain and noting anything that might challenge his established order. When Derek's gaze landed on Jake for the first time, the assessment was quick but thorough. New kid, obviously military based on the posture and haircut, sitting alone, no. Immediate social connections or protection. Jake could practically see Derek filing him away in the category of future entertainment, someone who might prove useful for demonstrating power when the mood struck. The interaction lasted less than 3 seconds, but Jake recognized it for what it was. He'd seen the same look from bullies at schools across the country, predators who instinctively identified isolated prey. The smart move would be to stay invisible, avoid any situation that might attract Derek's attention, graduate quietly, and move on with his life. But something about the way Derek had looked at him, with that casual assessment of vulnerability, reminded Jake of his father's warnings about predators. They only understood strength, and they interpreted kindness as weakness. More importantly, they rarely stopped with just one victim. As Jake finished his lunch and prepared for fifth period pay, he made a mental note to be extra careful around Derek Mitchell and his crew. He had no interest in becoming anyone's entertainment, and he certainly didn't want to create problems that might force another family move. His mother had finally found a job she loved, and his father needed to know they were stable and secure. The afternoon sun was blazing as Jake made his way to the gymnasium for physical education, the one class he actually enjoyed regardless of which school he attended. Coach Williams, a former Marine who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, ran the program with military efficiency and earned respect through competence rather than fear. The locker room buzzed with the typical pre-class energy as students changed into their pay uniforms. Jake had learned to change quickly and quietly, avoiding the social dynamics that often played out in these spaces. But as he pulled on his standard issue gym shorts and t-shirt, he couldn't help but overhear the conversation happening just around the corner. Derek Mitchell was holding court again, this time discussing his plans for someone he referred to as the new military brat. The casual cruelty in his voice was unmistakable as he described various ways to welcome Jake to Lincoln High, each suggestion more humiliating than the last. His crew laughed and offered their own ideas, treating the whole thing like a game they'd played many times before. Jake's jaw tightened as he listened, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was exactly the kind of situation his father had prepared him for, not through lectures but through years of training disguised as father-son bonding time. Control your emotions, assess the threat, plan your response, but never strike first, unless absolutely necessary. Coach Williams blew his whistle, summoning the class to the main gymnasium floor. The day's activity was basketball. Teams chosen by volunteer captains in the time-honored tradition that always revealed the school's social hierarchy. Derek, as the star quarterback, was automatically selected as one captain. The other captain was Ryan Carter, the wrestling team leader and Derek's closest friend. Jake was chosen last, which surprised no one and bothered him not at all. He'd been chosen last in P classes at schools across the country and had learned to use the low expectations to his advantage. Better to be underestimated than to reveal his actual capabilities before it was necessary. The game proceeded as expected, with Derek dominating through size and athleticism while making sure everyone noticed his superior skills. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, that Derek's casual assessment from lunch was developing into something more active and dangerous. His instincts proved correct when Derek engineered a collision during a rebound attempt, using his size advantage to send Jake sprawling across the gymnasium floor. The impact was harder than necessary, designed to humiliate rather than just gain possession of the ball. "Sorry about that, military boy," Derek said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe you should stick to activities more your speed." Jake picked himself up without comment, brushing off his gym clothes and returning to the game. But he noticed that Derek's crew was watching for his reaction, testing his resolve and measuring his willingness to fight back. This was how it always started, with small provocations designed to gauge the victim's response. The rest of pay passed without further incident, but Jake could feel the weight of attention from Derek and his friends. They'd identified him as their next target, and the only question now was when and how they'd make their move. As the final bell rang and students headed to their last period classes, Jake realized that his plan to remain invisible had already failed. Derek Mitchell had noticed him, marked him, and decided he represented some kind of threat that needed to be addressed. The collision in basketball had been a warning shot, a preview of what was coming if Jake didn't find a way to deflect the attention elsewhere. Walking to his final class of the day, Jake found himself thinking about his father's advice regarding bullies and predators. Sometimes the only way to stop them was to make the cost of their aggression higher than they were willing to pay. But his father had also taught him that violence should always be a last resort, used only when all other options had been exhausted. The problem was that Derek Mitchell didn't seem like the type of person who responded to reason or negotiation. He was used to getting his way through intimidation and force, protected by his status and his family's influence in the community. Taking him on would require careful planning and perfect execution, because there would only be one chance to get it right. As Jake settled into his final class of the day, he couldn't help but wonder if this school would end up being just like all the others. Another place where he'd have to choose between standing up for himself and protecting his family's stability. Another situation where his father's training might prove more valuable than any textbook. The afternoon sun slanted through the classroom. Windows, as his art teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, began discussing their first assignment. But Jake's mind was elsewhere, already planning for the confrontation he knew was coming. Derek Mitchell had made his intentions clear, and Jake's father had taught him that the best defense was often a perfectly timed and executed offense. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Jake suspected that his carefully maintained invisibility was about to become impossible to sustain. The question wasn't whether Derek would make his move, but when and where it would happen. And when it did, Jake would be ready to respond with skills that Derek couldn't possibly imagine. The quiet military kid was about to teach Lincoln High School a lesson about making assumptions. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made Southern California feel almost seasonal. Jake arrived at Lincoln High 30 minutes early, a habit ingrained by years of military precision and reinforced by his father's constant reminders about preparation and punctuality. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few teachers' cars and the custodial staff finishing their morning rounds. He used the quiet time to walk the campus perimeter, mentally mapping exit routes and identifying potential conflict zones. The gymnasium where yesterday's basketball incident had occurred sat at the far end of the main building, connected by a covered walkway that could easily become a choke point if someone wanted to corner him. The football field dominated the eastern side of campus, surrounded by bleachers that could seat 3,000 screaming fans on Friday nights. But it was the area behind the Industrial Arts Building that caught Jake's attention. A secluded courtyard surrounded by high walls and accessible through only two narrow entrances. The kind of place where confrontations could happen away from teacher supervision and security cameras. He filed the information away, knowing that bullies like Derek Mitchell preferred to operate in spaces where their actions wouldn't be documented or interrupted. The early morning stillness was broken by the rumble of a diesel engine as a massive black pickup truck pulled into the student parking lot. The vehicle was lifted 6 inches higher than factory specifications, equipped with oversized tires and a custom exhaust system that announced its presence from blocks away. Chrome accessories gleamed in the morning sun, and the price tag for all the modifications probably exceeded what Jake's mother made in 6 months. Derek Mitchell stepped out of the driver's seat like he was exiting a throne, his movements calculated to draw maximum attention even in the nearly empty parking lot. He wore expensive jeans, a perfectly fitted polo shirt, and leather boots that had never seen actual work. Everything about his appearance screamed wealth and privilege, from his designer watch to his styled hair that had probably required an hour of morning preparation. Jake watched from across the parking lot as Derek's crew began arriving in their own expensive vehicles. Ryan Carter pulled up in a red Camaro that his parents had bought him for his 17th birthday. Alex Brooks drove a white BMW convertible that he'd received as a reward for maintaining a C average. Tyler Webb arrived in a Mercedes SUV that cost more than most people's annual salary. Each arrival was choreographed to reinforce the group's status and wealth. They gathered around Derek's truck like courtiers surrounding a king, their laughter carrying across the empty parking lot as they discussed their plans for the day. Jake couldn't hear the specific words, but the body language was unmistakable. They were hunting, and they'd already selected their prey. As more students began arriving for the school day, Jake made his way toward the main building, keeping his distance from Derek's group while maintaining visual contact. His father had taught him that situational awareness was the foundation of personal security, and right now every instinct he possessed was screaming that danger was approaching. The morning classes passed in a blur of routine academic activities, but Jake could feel the weight of observation throughout the day. Derek's crew had obviously spread the word about their new target, and Jake noticed the subtle signs of anticipation building among the popular crowd. Whispered conversations that stopped when he walked by, knowing glances exchanged between students, the kind of electric tension that preceded a major social event. During third period English literature, Jake found himself sitting 2 rows behind Maria Santos, the observant girl who'd caught his attention on his first day. She was taking notes on Miss Park's lecture about character development in classic literature, but Jake noticed that she was also glancing around the classroom with the same kind of awareness he'd been trained to maintain. When the bell rang ending the period, Maria lingered as other students filed out of the classroom. She approached Jake's desk with the confident stride of someone who'd made a decision and was prepared to act on it. "You're Jake Thompson, right?" she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested Spanish was her first language. "The new kid from the military family?" Jake nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading but impressed by her direct approach. Most students at Lincoln High seemed to communicate through social media and gossip networks, but Maria clearly preferred face-to-face interaction. "I'm Maria Santos," she continued, extending her hand for a firm handshake. "I write for the school newspaper, and I've been watching what's happening around here. Derek Mitchell and his crew have been talking about you since yesterday." The confirmation of what Jake already suspected didn't surprise him, but hearing it stated so directly was somehow both refreshing and concerning. Maria clearly wasn't someone who danced around difficult topics or pretended not to notice obvious problems. "What kind of talking?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Maria glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. "The kind that usually ends with someone getting hurt or humiliated. Derek doesn't like new students who don't immediately show him the respect he thinks he deserves." Jake appreciated her honesty, but he also recognized the potential danger of being seen talking to someone who was obviously monitoring Derek's activities. Bullies like Derek viewed information gathering as a form of rebellion that needed to be punished. "I appreciate the warning," Jake said carefully, "but you might want to be careful about who sees you talking to me. I don't want to cause problems for anyone else." Maria's expression hardened slightly, revealing a core of steel beneath her friendly exterior. "Derek Mitchell doesn't get to decide who I talk to or what I write about. This is America, not some dictatorship where the quarterback gets to control everyone's behavior." Her courage was admirable, but Jake recognized the naivety that often accompanied idealistic thinking. Derek might not have legal authority over other students, but social power could be just as effective as official power when wielded by someone willing to use it ruthlessly. The lunch period brought the day's first real test of Jake's ability to avoid confrontation. The cafeteria was buzzing with more energy than usual, the kind of anticipatory excitement that preceded major social events. Jake could feel eyes on him as he moved through the lunch line, purchasing the same simple meal he'd chosen the day before. But when he turned to find a seat, he discovered that his usual table was occupied by 3 freshman girls who looked terrified to be sitting anywhere near the back of the cafeteria. The message was clear. Derek's influence extended far enough to manipulate even the most basic aspects of daily routine. Jake scanned the room for alternative seating options, acutely aware that his choice would be interpreted as either submission or defiance. The safest option would be to take his lunch outside and eat alone, avoiding the social dynamics entirely. But that would also signal weakness to Derek and his crew, potentially accelerating whatever timeline they'd established for their campaign of harassment. Instead, Jake chose a middle path that his father had taught him to consider in complex, tactical situations. He approached a table occupied by members of the school's ROTC program, students who would understand military culture and might be less likely to be intimidated by Derek's social pressure. "Mind if I sit here?" Jake asked, addressing the question to a serious-looking senior who wore his ROTC uniform with obvious pride. The senior, whose name tag identified him as Cadet Major Thompson, looked up from his meal with the kind of assessing gaze that Jake recognized from military environments. "You're the new kid, right? Son of a deployed serviceman?" Jake nodded, noting that news of his family background had already spread through the school's military community. "My father's a master chief with the teams." The effect was immediate and noticeable. The entire table of ROTC students straightened slightly, their expressions shifting from casual interest to genuine respect. In military culture, Navy SEALs occupied a position of almost mythical reverence, and being the son of a SEAL team operator carried significant weight. "Please sit," Cadet Major Thompson said, gesturing to an empty chair. "We were just discussing the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony. Your father's service record would make him a natural choice for guest speaker if he's back from deployment by then." Jake appreciated the acceptance, but he also noticed that their conversation was being monitored from across the cafeteria. Derek's table had gone quiet, and several members of his crew were obviously listening to try to understand what was happening at the ROTC table. The conversation continued for the remainder of the lunch period, covering topics ranging from military history to college ROTC programs. Jake found himself relaxing slightly, surrounded by students who understood his background and respected his family's service. But he also remained aware that his association with the ROTC program might be interpreted as a form of alliance building that Derek would find threatening. As the lunch bell rang and students began clearing their tables, Jake noticed Alex Brooks approaching with his phone held at waist level. The device was obviously recording, though Alex was trying to be subtle about it. The implication was clear. Derek's crew was gathering intelligence and documenting Jake's interactions for future use. "Thanks for letting me sit with you, Jake." said to the ROTC students, standing to clear his tray. "Anytime," Cadet Major Thompson replied. "Military families stick together, especially when we're dealing with civilians who don't understand what service means." The comment was obviously directed toward Alex Brooks, who was still lingering nearby with his phone. The message was equally clear. The ROTC program was prepared to support Jake if the situation escalated beyond normal social conflict. As Jake left the cafeteria, he found himself thinking about the complex dynamics he'd just witnessed. Derek's crew was systematically gathering information and applying pressure, but they were also encountering resistance from unexpected sources. The ROTC students represented a form of organized opposition that Derek couldn't easily intimidate or dismiss. The afternoon classes proceeded without incident, but Jake could feel the tension building throughout the school. Word was spreading that something significant was about to happen, and students were beginning to choose sides in a conflict that hadn't yet erupted into open hostilities. During 6th period trigonometry, Jake received a text message from an unknown number. "Football field, after school. Come alone if you want to avoid making this worse for everyone." Jake deleted the message immediately, but the implication was clear. Derek had decided to accelerate his timeline and force a confrontation in a location where he held maximum advantage. The football field was Derek's territory, surrounded by symbols of his athletic achievements and social status. The smart tactical response would be to avoid the meeting entirely. But Jake recognized that Derek would interpret no-show as weakness and escalate his harassment campaign accordingly. Sometimes the only way to prevent a larger conflict was to engage in a smaller one on terms that weren't completely disadvantageous. As the final bell rang ending the academic day, Jake made his decision. He would attend Derek's meeting, but he would do so on his own terms and with his own preparation. His father had taught him that the key to surviving dangerous situations was to control as many variables as possible while remaining flexible enough to adapt when circumstances changed. The football field was deserted except for Derek and his 3 closest allies. They stood at the 50-yard line like they owned the entire campus, their body language radiating confidence and anticipation. Jake approached from the main entrance, moving with the controlled gait his father had drilled into him during countless training sessions. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," Derek called out when Jake was still 20 yards away. "Most military brats are too scared to face real men when they're outnumbered." Jake stopped at the 30-yard line, close enough to hear normal conversation, but far enough away to maintain tactical distance. "You wanted to talk. I'm here. What do you want?" Derek's grin was the kind of expression predators wore when they were certain of their superiority. "I want you to understand how things work at Lincoln High. This is my school, my territory, my kingdom. New students, especially temporary ones like you, need to show proper respect." The demand was exactly what Jake had expected, but hearing it stated so baldly confirmed that Derek was even more arrogant than he'd initially appeared. The quarterback genuinely believed that his athletic achievements and family wealth gave him the right to control other students' behavior. "And what exactly does proper respect look like?" Jake asked, his voice remaining calm despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through his system. Ryan Carter stepped forward, his wrestler's build and aggressive posture designed to intimidate. "It means you sit where we tell you to sit, you talk to who we say you can talk to, and you remember that you're just passing through while we're Lincoln High royalty." Alex Brooks held up his phone, obviously recording the entire confrontation. "It also means you don't get friendly with people who might give you ideas about being more important than you actually are." The reference to his lunch conversation with the ROTC students confirmed that Derek's crew had been monitoring his activities more closely than Jake had realized. They weren't just bullying him randomly. They were systematically working to isolate him from potential allies and support networks. Tyler Webb, who'd remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "My father knows the base commander at Pendleton. One phone call from him, and your family could find themselves transferred to some really unpleasant assignment. The threat against his family crossed a line that Jake's father had specifically warned him about. Personal harassment was one thing, but threatening family members was a form of escalation that required immediate and decisive response. "Is that supposed to scare me?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the new edge that made Derek's crew exchange uncertain glances. Derek seemed to sense that the dynamic was shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated. "It should. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of your league. This doesn't have to get ugly, but it will if you don't start showing the proper attitude." Jake took a step closer, his movement controlled but purposeful. "You're right about one thing. This doesn't have to get ugly. But threatening my family was a mistake." The football field fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic from the main road. Derek's confidence flickered for just a moment as he processed Jake's response, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "You think you're tough because your daddy plays soldier?" Derek sneered. "This is the real-world military, boy. Money and connections matter more than whatever bedtime stories your father told you about honor and courage." Jake felt something cold and calculating settle into his mind, the same mental state his father had trained him to access during high-stress situations. Emotion became secondary to tactical assessment. Fear transformed into focused energy, and the training that had been drilled into him since childhood began to surface. "Last chance," Jake said quietly. "Walk away now, and we can pretend this conversation never happened." Derek's laughter was harsh and dismissive. "You're giving me ultimatums? You're even dumber than I thought." He nodded to Ryan Carter, who began moving to Jake's left while Tyler Webb circled to his right. The tactical situation was exactly what Jake had expected. 4 against 1, with Derek hanging back to avoid direct confrontation while his crew did the actual work. But Derek had made a critical error in his assessment of the situation. He was thinking like a high school bully dealing with a typical victim, not like a military strategist facing an opponent with professional training and years of preparation. As Ryan Carter reached for Jake's shoulder, intending to grab him and hold him for the others, Jake's father's voice echoed in his mind. Speed, surprise, and violence of action. End it quickly before they understand what's happening. The next few seconds would teach Derek Mitchell and his crew that they had gravely miscalculated their opponent. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the 5 students on the football field, Maria Santos was positioned in the press box with her camera equipment, documenting everything for the story she'd been planning to write about bullying at Lincoln High. What she was about to witness would become the most important footage of her journalistic career. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the football field as Jake prepared to show Derek Mitchell exactly what happened when someone threatened a Navy SEAL's family. The quiet military kid was about to become a very different kind of student, and Lincoln High School would never be the same. Derek's crew closed in with the casual confidence of predators who'd never encountered real resistance. Ryan Carter's wrestling background made him feel invincible against a smaller opponent, while Tyler Webb's size advantage seemed to guarantee victory. Alex Brooks kept his phone steady, preparing to record what they expected to be Jake's complete humiliation. But Jake's father had spent 13 years preparing his son for exactly this kind of situation, and the training was about to pay dividends that Derek couldn't possibly imagine. The transformation was subtle but complete. Jake's posture shifted from defensive to aggressive. His breathing became controlled and purposeful, and his eyes began tracking multiple targets with the kind of precision that separated professionals from amateurs. Every lesson his father had taught him about situational awareness, tactical thinking, and combat effectiveness suddenly became relevant in ways that a high school football field had never experienced. Derek noticed the change first, his bully's instincts warning him that something fundamental had shifted in his praised demeanor. But arrogance and social pressure made it impossible for him to back down now. especially with Alex recording everything for later distribution throughout the school. "Do it," Derek commanded, his voice carrying less confidence than it had moments earlier. Ryan Carter lunged forward, intending to grab Jake in a bear hug that would allow the others to join the attack safely. But Jake wasn't there when Ryan's arms closed around empty air. The movement was so fluid and unexpected that Ryan stumbled forward, off balance and vulnerable. Jake's response was textbook Navy SEAL close-quarters combat, a precise elbow strike to Ryan's solar plexus that dropped the wrestler to his knees, gasping for air and completely out of the fight. The entire exchange lasted less than 2 seconds, but it demonstrated a level of skill and training that shocked everyone present. Tyler Webb hesitated, suddenly realizing that they weren't dealing with a typical victim. But his hesitation cost him the initiative, and Jake's father had taught him that in combat, hesitation was often fatal. Jake closed the distance between himself and Tyler with explosive speed, using footwork that would have impressed his father's instructors at the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. A quick jab to Tyler's throat, followed by a sweep that sent him crashing to the artificial turf, eliminated the second threat before Derek could fully process what was happening. Alex Brooks was so focused on recording that he didn't see Jake's approach until it was too late. A precise strike to his wrist sent the phone flying across the field, while a follow-up move left Alex sitting on the ground, cradling his arm and wondering how the quiet new kid had moved so fast. The entire engagement had lasted less than 15 seconds, but Derek's 3 closest allies were down and no longer represented any threat. Jake stood in the center of the field, barely breathing hard, his eyes locked on Derek with the kind of focused intensity that made the quarterback's blood run cold. "Your turn," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying none of the emotion Derek had expected from a victim who'd just been cornered and threatened. Derek's world had just been turned upside down in ways he couldn't comprehend. His entire identity was built around being the alpha male, the dominant force that other students feared and respected. But the quiet military kid he'd selected for harassment had just dismantled his crew with a level of skill that belonged in action movies, not high school confrontations. For the first time in his 18 years of life, Derek Mitchell found himself genuinely afraid of another student. And that fear was about to make him very, very dangerous. The sun was beginning to set over Lincoln High as Jake stood on the football field, surrounded by Derek's defeated crew and facing the quarterback, who was slowly realizing that his entire worldview had just been shattered. The real confrontation was about to begin, and Derek's next decision would determine whether this ended with mutual respect or escalated into something far more serious. In the press box, Maria Santos had captured everything on camera, her journalistic instincts telling her that she'd just witnessed the beginning of a story that would change Lincoln High School forever. The quiet military kid had revealed himself to be something far more dangerous than anyone had suspected, and the implications were about to ripple through the entire school community. Jake's father had always told him that the most important battles were often fought not with weapons, but with the courage to stand up for what was right when it would have been easier to walk away. As Derek Mitchell prepared to make his next move, Jake realized that his father's training had prepared him for far more than just physical confrontation. The real test was about to begin. Derek Mitchell stared at his 3 friends writhing on the artificial turf, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Ryan Carter, the state wrestling champion who'd never lost a match in high school, was still gasping for air and clutching his stomach. Tyler Webb, who outweighed Jake by 40 pounds, was trying to sit up while blood trickled from his nose. Alex Brooks cradled his wrist against his chest, his expensive phone line shattered 20 feet away. In less than 15 seconds, everything Derek thought he knew about power and dominance had been obliterated by a quiet kid who looked like he should be stocking groceries at the commissary. "What the hell are you?" Derek whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his friend's labored breathing. Jake remained perfectly still, his posture relaxed but ready, his eyes never leaving Derek's face. The transformation from nervous new student to lethal operator was so complete that Derek wondered if he'd somehow been dealing with two different people all along. "I'm someone whose family you threatened," Jake replied, his tone carrying the kind of quiet certainty that made Derek's skin crawl. "Someone whose father taught him that there are lines you don't cross, and consequences for people who cross them anyway." Derek's hands were shaking, though whether from rage or fear, he couldn't tell. His entire identity was built around being the apex predator at Lincoln High, the untouchable king who controlled lesser students through intimidation and social pressure. But Jake had just proven that all of Derek's advantages meant nothing against someone with real training and the willingness to use it. "You think this is over?" Derek snarled, his voice rising as desperation began to override self-preservation. "You think you can assault 3 students and just walk away? My father owns half this town, and the police chief plays golf with him every weekend." Jake's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Your father isn't here right now. It's just you and me." The simple statement hit Derek like a physical blow. For the first time in his privileged life, his family's money and connections were irrelevant. There were no teachers to impress, no parents to manipulate, no social media followers to perform for. Just 2 teenagers on an empty football field. And one of them had just demonstrated capabilities that Derek couldn't begin to understand. Ryan Carter finally managed to struggle to his feet, his face pale and his breathing still labored. "Derek, we need to get out of here," he wheezed. "This guy's not normal. He fights like he's been doing it his whole life." "Shut up," Derek snapped, his fear manifesting as anger toward his injured friend. "We don't run from military trash, we make them run from us." But even as he said the words, Derek could feel his confidence crumbling. Jake stood 10 feet away, completely calm and apparently unaffected by the violence he'd just unleashed. There was something terrifying about someone who could hurt people with such clinical precision and then return to perfect stillness, like a weapon that had been fired and was now waiting to be used again. Tyler Webb was attempting to clean the blood from his nose with his expensive polo shirt, his earlier arrogance replaced by shocked confusion. How did he move so fast? "I barely saw him coming." Alex Brooks was examining his damaged phone with the horrified expression of someone whose entire social life had just been destroyed. $300, he muttered. "My parents are going to kill me." Derek wanted to scream at them to stop talking, to stop showing weakness, to remember who they were supposed to be. But he could see the truth in their eyes. They were done fighting. Jake had broken them with surgical precision, and they had no desire to experience his capabilities again. "This isn't over," Derek said, backing away from Jake while trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. "You made a big mistake today, military boy. Bigger than you know." Jake didn't respond, but he didn't need to. His message had been delivered with perfect clarity: threaten his family and face the consequences. Derek and his crew had learned that lesson in the most painful way possible. As the 4 seniors limped off the football field, Jake finally allowed himself to breathe normally. The adrenaline was still flowing through his system, making his hands tingle and his heart race. But the immediate threat had been neutralized. His father would have been proud of his restraint. He'd used exactly the amount of force necessary to end the confrontation without causing permanent injury. But Jake also knew that Derek Mitchell wasn't the type of person who accepted defeat gracefully. The quarterback's parting words had carried the weight of a promise, and Jake suspected that the real conflict was just beginning. The next morning brought an unexpected twist that Jake hadn't anticipated. When he arrived at Lincoln High, the usual buzz of student conversation seemed muted, replaced by an undercurrent of tension that permeated the entire campus. Students were talking in hushed voices, glancing around nervously and clustering in smaller groups than usual. Jake's first clue about what had happened came from Maria Santos, who intercepted him before he could reach his locker. Her usually composed demeanor was replaced by barely contained excitement, and she was clutching the tablet computer against her chest like it contained nuclear secrets. "We need to talk," she said urgently, grabbing Jake's arm and steering him toward an empty classroom, away from everyone else. Once they were alone, Maria opened her tablet and showed Jake a video that made his stomach drop. The footage was crystal clear, showing every detail of the previous day's confrontation on the football field. Jake watched himself systematically dismantle Derek's crew with moves that looked even more impressive on camera than they had felt. "In real time, you were recording?" Jake asked, though the evidence was undeniable. Maria nodded, her eyes bright with journalistic fervor. "I've been documenting Derek's bullying for months, waiting for something big enough to make the administration take action. But this," she gestured at the tablet screen, "this is bigger than I ever imagined." The video showed everything: Derek's arrogant demands, the threats against Jake's family, the coordinated attack by his crew, and Jake's devastating response. But what made Jake's blood run cold was the timestamp in the corner of the screen. The video had been uploaded to social media at 11:30 the previous night, which meant it had been circulating for hours. "How many people have seen this?" Jake asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "The original post has 12,000 views," Maria replied. "But it's been shared and reposted dozens of times. Local news stations are already calling the school for comment." Jake closed his eyes and tried to calculate the implications. His father had always stressed the importance of operational security, of keeping family business private and avoiding unnecessary attention. A viral video of his son demonstrating Navy SEAL techniques was exactly the kind of exposure that could complicate his father's deployments and put the entire family at risk. "Can you take it down?" Jake asked. Maria shook her head. "Even if I deleted my original post, there are already too many copies out there. This has taken on a life of its own." The classroom door opened suddenly, and Coach Williams entered with the purposeful stride of a man on a mission. The former Marine's weathered face was grim as he approached Jake and Maria, his eyes showing a mixture of concern and professional curiosity. "Thompson," Coach Williams said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We need to have a conversation. Santos, you too." They followed the coach to his office adjacent to the gymnasium, where he'd closed the door and activated a white noise machine that Jake recognized as military surplus equipment. The precaution suggested that Coach Williams understood the sensitivity of whatever discussion was about to take place. "I've seen the video," Coach Williams said without preamble. "Multiple times, in fact. Along with half the school district, and apparently most of Southern California, based on my phone calls this morning." Jake remained silent, knowing that anything he said could make the situation worse. "Those moves you used," Coach Williams continued, studying Jake with the analytical gaze of a professional warrior. "That's not something you learn in civilian martial arts classes. That's military training, specific and advanced. The kind they teach to people who do very dangerous jobs in very dangerous places." The coach leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Your father's deployed, isn't he? Somewhere he can't talk about, doing things he can't discuss?" Jake nodded reluctantly, realizing that Coach Williams had already figured out more than was safe for any civilian to know. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan," Coach Williams said. "Saw some of the teams in action during joint operations. Impressive. Doesn't begin to describe it. But here's what concerns me. If your father's who I think he is, and he's doing what I think he's doing, then this video could create problems that go way beyond high school politics." The coach was right, and Jake knew it. Navy SEAL operations depended on secrecy and anonymity, on the enemy not knowing who was coming for them or where they were vulnerable. A viral video identifying Jake as a SEAL's son could potentially be used by hostile intelligence services to track down operational personnel and their families. "What do we do?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Coach Williams was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing options and consequences. "First, we contain the damage as much as possible. Maria, I need you to contact whoever you know in local media and explain that this involves the family of an active duty service member. Most legitimate news organizations will respect operational security concerns if they understand what's at stake." Maria nodded, already making notes on her tablet. "I can reach out to my contacts at the Tribune and Channel 7. They'll understand." "Second," Coach Williams continued, "we need to prepare for Derek Mitchell's response. That boy doesn't handle humiliation well under the best of circumstances, and having his defeat broadcast to thousands of people is going to make him desperate. Desperate people do stupid things." As if summoned by the coach's words, the intercom crackled to life with Principal Hayes' voice. "Jake Thompson, please report to the main office immediately." Jake Thompson to the main office. The three of them exchanged glances, all understanding that the situation was about to escalate beyond their ability to manage privately. The walk to the principal's office felt like the longest journey of Jake's life. Students lined the hallways, their conversations stopping abruptly when they saw him pass. Some looks were admiring, others were fearful, but all were intensely curious about the quiet new kid who'd become an overnight internet sensation. Principal Hayes' office was crowded with more people than Jake had expected. Dr. Hayes sat behind her desk, looking overwhelmed, while Vice Principal Rodriguez stood near the window with his arms crossed. But it was the other occupants that made Jake's heart sink. Derek's parents, Robert and Linda Mitchell, were seated in expensive leather chairs, their faces radiating the kind of righteous indignation that only came from having their privileged worldview challenged. Robert Mitchell was everything Jake had expected from Derek's descriptions. Tall, imposing, with silver hair and a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than most teachers made in a month. His wife was equally polished, her jewelry and clothing screaming wealth and social status. They looked like people who were accustomed to getting their way through a combination of money and intimidation. "Ah, Mr. Thompson," Principal Hayes said with forced cheerfulness. "Please, have a seat. We were just discussing yesterday's unfortunate incident." Jake remained standing, his father's training telling him to maintain mobility and tactical awareness. "What incident would that be?" Robert Mitchell's face reddened at Jake's apparent insolence. "Don't play dumb with us, boy. You assaulted my son and his friends on school property. That's battery, possibly assault with a deadly weapon, considering your apparent training." The accusation was so ridiculous that Jake almost laughed. "Deadly weapon? I used my hands." "Hands that have been trained to kill," Linda Mitchell interjected, her voice shrill with manufactured outrage. "We've researched your family background. Mr. Thompson, your father is some kind of special forces operative, which means you've probably been learning combat techniques since you could walk." Vice Principal Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. "Let's focus on what actually happened yesterday. Mr. Thompson, can you explain the confrontation on the football field?" Jake chose his words carefully, knowing that anything he said would be analyzed and potentially used against him later. "Derek Mitchell and his friends cornered me after school. They made threats against my family and then attacked me. I defended myself using reasonable force." "Reasonable force?" Robert Mitchell laughed harshly. "You hospitalized 3 boys. Ryan Carter is seeing a doctor for his injuries. Tyler Webb has a concussion, and Alex Brooks may need surgery on his wrist." The exaggerations were obvious. Attempts to make Jake's response seem disproportionate, but the underlying message was clear. The Mitchell family was preparing to escalate this beyond the school's disciplinary system. Principal Hayes looked miserable as she tried to navigate between the competing narratives. Mr. Thompson, while we understand that you were defending yourself, the level of force you used raises serious concerns. These boys required medical attention. They attacked me 4-1, Jake replied. How much force was I supposed to use? Just enough to make them angry, but not enough to stop them? Vice Principal Rodriguez nodded approvingly at Jake's logic, but Robert Mitchell wasn't finished. We want this boy expelled immediately, he demanded. And we're filing criminal charges for assault and battery. Someone needs to teach these military brats that they can't bring their violence into civilized society. The insult to military families was too much for Vice Principal Rodriguez, whose own Marine Corps' background had been mentioned in Jake's research. Mr. Mitchell, I'd be careful about disparaging military families. They've sacrificed more for this country than most civilians can imagine. The tension in the room was becoming palpable when the office door opened and an unexpected figure entered. Sarah Thompson, Jake's mother, walked in wearing her hospital scrubs and carrying herself with the quiet dignity of a military spouse who'd dealt with difficult situations before. I apologize for being late, she said, her voice calm but firm. I came as soon as I received the school's call. Principal Hayes gestured to an empty chair. Mrs. Thompson, we were just discussing yesterday's incident involving your son. Sarah remained standing, her nurse's training evident in the way she quickly assessed everyone in the room. Before we discuss anything, I'd like to see the video. Evidence that I understand exists. Robert Mitchell's confident expression faltered slightly. Video evidence? The footage that's been circulating on social media, Sarah continued. The one that shows exactly what happened and who initiated the confrontation. Linda Mitchell shot her husband a sharp look, clearly indicating that they hadn't expected Jake's family to be aware of the video's existence. Their entire strategy had apparently been based on controlling the narrative and presenting Derek as the victim. Vice Principal Rodriguez pulled out his tablet and queued up the video that Maria had recorded. I think we should all watch this together, to make sure we're discussing the same incident. The room fell silent as the video played, showing Derek's arrogant demands, his crew's coordinated attack, and Jake's precise response. When it ended, the atmosphere had changed completely. I see, Sarah said quietly. So my son was outnumbered 4-1, threatened with violence, and attacked first. His response was to defend himself using the minimum force necessary to neutralize multiple attackers. Robert Mitchell's face was now purple with rage. That video was taken illegally. It can't be used as evidence. Actually, Vice Principal Rodriguez said with barely concealed satisfaction, California is a one-party consent state for recordings in public spaces. The video is completely legal and admissible. The meeting continued for another hour, but the outcome was never really in doubt once the video evidence was reviewed. Derek and his crew would face suspension for initiating the confrontation and making threats. Jake would receive a formal reprimand for fighting on school property, but no further punishment. As they left the principal's office, Sarah put her arm around her son's shoulders. Your father is going to want to hear about this, she said quietly. All of it. Jake nodded, knowing that his father would understand both the tactical situation and the broader implications of the viral video. The quiet military kid had been forced to reveal his capabilities, and now the entire family would have to deal with the consequences. The rest of the school day passed in a surreal blur of celebrity and notoriety. Students who'd never acknowledged Jake's existence suddenly wanted to be his friend. Teachers looked at him with a mixture of respect and wariness. The video had transformed him from invisible new kid to campus legend in less than 24 hours. But Jake knew that Derek Mitchell wasn't finished. The quarterback's family had too much pride and too much money to accept defeat gracefully. They would regroup, recalculate, and return with a strategy that took into account Jake's true capabilities. The real battle was just beginning, And this time, it wouldn't be fought with fists on a football field. That evening, Jake sat in his modest bedroom, staring at his phone as notifications continued to flood in from social media platforms he'd never even heard of. The video had gone beyond viral. It had become a cultural phenomenon that was being analyzed by everyone from military historians to anti-bullying advocates. His mother knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege she'd earned through 18 years of military family life. "Your father called," she said simply. Jake looked up, knowing that this conversation had been inevitable since the moment Maria's video went online. "He's proud of you," Sarah continued. "But he's also concerned about operational security. The attention you're getting could complicate things for his unit." Jake had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the weight of responsibility feel even heavier. His moment of self-defense had potentially put his father and his teammates at risk, a consequence he'd never intended but couldn't ignore. "What happens now?" Jake asked. Sarah sat on the edge of his bed, her expression thoughtful. "Now we deal with the reality that our family is no longer anonymous. Your father's working with his command to assess the security implications. In the meantime, we stay alert and we stick together." Outside, the California evening was peaceful and quiet, but Jake knew that appearances could be deceiving. Derek Mitchell and his family were somewhere in the same town, plotting their next move and counting on their wealth and influence to even the score. The video had made Jake famous, but it had also made him a target for people with resources and connections he couldn't match. The quiet military kid had won the first battle, but the war for Lincoln High School was just beginning. And this time, his opponents would be prepared for what they were facing. As Jake finally drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that his father's training had prepared him for physical confrontations, but the social and political battles ahead would require different skills entirely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Jake would need to learn quickly how to navigate a world where viral videos and family influence mattered as much as tactical skills and personal courage. The transformation from invisible new student to internet sensation was complete, but the real test of Jake Thompson's character was about to begin. The Mitchell family's counterattack came exactly 1 week after the viral video had destroyed Derek's reputation, and it arrived with the precision of a military operation backed by unlimited financial resources. Jake discovered the scope of their campaign when he arrived at school Monday morning to find Lincoln High crawling with television news crews, investigative reporters, and what appeared to be federal agents in dark suits. Principal Hayes stood near the main entrance, looking harried and overwhelmed as she fielded questions from a crowd of journalists. The questions Jake could overhear were troubling, focusing not on the bullying incident, but on his family's military background and potential security implications of the viral footage. "Is it true that classified military techniques were demonstrated by a minor?" one reporter shouted. "Can you confirm that the student's father is involved in covert operations?" Another demanded. "What measures is the school taking to address potential national security breaches?" A third voice added. Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized the Mitchell family's new strategy. Unable to win a direct confrontation based on facts, they'd apparently decided to reframe the entire incident as a national security issue. It was brilliant in its ruthlessness, shifting the focus from Derek's bullying to Jake's family's classified background. Maria Santos appeared beside him, her reporter's instincts fully activated by the media circus surrounding their school. "This is bad," she said quietly. "Really bad. Someone with serious connections has been feeding information to these news outlets." Jake didn't need to guess who that someone might be. Robert Mitchell had apparently decided that if his son was going to be humiliated, he'd take Jake's entire family down with him. The first class of the day was canceled as administrators dealt with the media presence, but Jake was summoned to Principal Hayes' office where an even more disturbing scene awaited him. Two men in federal suits sat across from the principal's desk, their credentials identifying them as agents from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. "Mr. Thompson," the senior agent said without preamble, "I'm Agent Martinez, and this is Agent Chun. We need to discuss the viral video and its potential impact on ongoing military operations." Jake's worst fears were being realized in real time. His moment of self-defense had escalated into a federal investigation that could affect his father's career and potentially compromise active missions. "We understand that you were defending yourself," Agent Chun added, her tone slightly more sympathetic. "But the techniques you demonstrated in that video are recognizable to foreign intelligence services, who monitor social media for exactly this kind of information." Principal Hayes looked completely out of her depth as she tried to understand the implications. "Are you saying that Jake's actions created some kind of security risk?" Agent Martinez nodded grimly. "Military families are trained to maintain low profiles precisely because viral incidents like this can expose operational personnel to enemy tracking. Your school now has international attention, and not all of it is friendly." The meeting continued for 2 hours, covering everything from the video's global reach to the steps being taken to assess and mitigate any security breaches. Jake learned that his father's deployment had been extended indefinitely while his unit's operational security was reviewed, a consequence that made Jake feel sick with guilt and responsibility. When the agents finally left, Principal Hayes turned to Jake with an expression of exhausted sympathy. "I'm sorry this has gotten so complicated," she said, "but the school board is meeting this afternoon to discuss your continued enrollment here." The implication was clear. Lincoln High was preparing to sacrifice Jake to make the security concerns disappear, regardless of the fact that he'd been the victim of the original incident. Jake walked through the hallways of Lincoln High feeling like a ghost haunting his own life. Students stared at him with mixtures of awe and fear, unsure whether he was a hero or a security threat. Teachers avoided eye contact, clearly having received instructions about how to handle the situation. Even the ROTC students who'd supported him earlier seemed uncertain about maintaining their association. The only person who approached him directly was Coach Williams, who intercepted Jake near the gymnasium with the purposeful stride of a man who'd made a decision. "Thompson," Coach Williams said, "walk with me." They headed toward the empty football field where everything had started, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the artificial turf. Coach Williams was quiet for several minutes, clearly organizing his thoughts before speaking. "I've been in contact with some old Marine buddies who still work in intelligence," he finally said. "The situation is more serious than anyone's letting on publicly." Jake had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by someone with military connections made the reality even more frightening. "How serious?" Jake asked. Coach Williams stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "Serious. Enough that your family may need to relocate again, sooner than anyone planned. The video has been analyzed by multiple foreign intelligence services, and they've potentially identified patterns in your training that could compromise your father's unit." The weight of responsibility crashed down on Jake with devastating force. His single moment of self-defense had potentially put his father and his teammates in mortal danger, all because he'd refused to submit to Derek Mitchell's bullying. "There's something else," Coach Williams continued. "The Mitchell family has hired a private investigation firm to dig into your family's background. They're trying to find anything they can use to justify Derek's actions and discredit your response." Jake felt a cold anger building in his chest, different from the controlled aggression he'd used against Derek's crew. This was personal in ways that went far beyond high school politics. "What are they looking for?" Jake asked. "Anything they can spin," Coach Williams replied. "Medical records, financial information, your father's service record, your family's movement patterns over the years. They're basically trying to build a case that you're a dangerous individual who shouldn't be in civilian schools." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a black sedan that pulled up to the edge of the football field. Jake recognized the car as similar to the one the federal agents had been driving, but the woman who stepped out was someone he'd never seen before. She was tall and professional, wearing a dark suit and carrying herself with the kind of confidence that suggested significant authority. As she approached, Jake noticed that Coach Williams straightened slightly, his military bearing becoming more pronounced. "Coach Williams," the woman said, "I'm Commander Sarah Mitchell, Navy JAG Corps. I need to speak with Mr. Thompson about a legal matter concerning his family." The name Mitchell hit Jake like a physical blow. "Any relation to Derek Mitchell?" he asked. Commander Mitchell's expression darkened slightly. "Derek is my nephew," she said, "which is why I'm here to clean up the mess my brother-in-law has created." The revelation that Derek had a Navy officer in his extended family added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. But Commander Mitchell's tone suggested that her loyalties didn't necessarily align with her civilian relatives. "Robert Mitchell has been using family connections to pressure federal agencies into investigating your family," she continued. "He's convinced himself that if he can prove you're some kind of security risk, it will justify Derek's actions and restore the family's reputation." Coach Williams stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Jake and the commander in a gesture of subtle protection. "What kind of pressure are we talking about?" Commander Mitchell's expression was grim as she explained the scope of Robert Mitchell's campaign. "He's contacted congressional representatives, defense contractors, and media outlets with connections to military affairs. He's basically weaponized his wealth and influence to make your family's life as difficult as possible." Jake felt his world continuing to collapse around him. Not only had his actions potentially compromised his father's missions, but they'd also made his family the target of a systematic campaign by people with the resources to cause serious damage. However, Commander Mitchell continued, "Robert has made a critical error in his strategy." She pulled out a tablet and showed Jake and Coach Williams a series of documents that made Jake's eyes widen. Military service records, commendation letters, and what appeared to be classified operational summaries painted a picture of his father's career that went far beyond anything Jake had previously understood. "Your father isn't just any Navy SEAL," Commander Mitchell explained. "He's a Medal of Honor recipient who saved American lives in ways that can't be publicly acknowledged. When Robert started trying to use military channels to attack your family, he inadvertently drew attention from people who know exactly who your father is and what he's sacrificed for this country." The documents showed a level of heroism and service that made Jake feel both proud and intimidated. His father had never discussed the details of his deployments, but the official records revealed a career of extraordinary courage and dedication. The Joint Chiefs of Staff received a briefing about Robert Mitchell's campaign yesterday, Commander Mitchell continued. They were not pleased to learn that a defense contractor was attempting to use political pressure to attack the family of one of America's most decorated warriors. Coach Williams was studying the documents with the focused attention of someone who understood their significance. "This changes everything," he said quietly. Commander Mitchell nodded. Robert thought he was playing a game he could win through money and connections. He didn't realize he was attacking someone who has friends in very high places, people who don't appreciate civilians trying to manipulate military affairs for personal revenge. Jake felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since the federal agents had appeared at school. What happens now? "Now," Commander Mitchell said with a cold smile, "my brother-in-law learns that there are consequences for trying to destroy military families. His defense contracts are being reviewed for potential security violations. His political connections are being questioned about their judgment in supporting his campaign. And his son Derek is about to face some very uncomfortable truths about his behavior." The transformation of Jake's situation happened with startling speed over the next 48 hours. The media circus that had descended on Lincoln High began to shift its focus from Jake's family to the Mitchell family's apparent abuse of political connections. Investigative reporters who'd been fed information by Robert Mitchell suddenly found themselves investigating the source instead of the story. Jake arrived at school Wednesday morning to find a completely different atmosphere. The federal agents were gone, replaced by a single security liaison who was there to ensure Jake's safety rather than investigate his actions. The news crews had largely dispersed, having found more interesting stories in the ethical questions surrounding defense contractors using political influence for personal vendettas. But the most significant change was in Derek Mitchell himself. The quarterback who'd ruled Lincoln High through intimidation and arrogance was nowhere to be seen, having been quietly transferred to a private military academy by parents who were suddenly facing federal scrutiny of their business practices. Maria Santos found Jake at his locker with news that provided the final pieces of the puzzle. "I've been investigating the Mitchell family's response to the viral video," she said, her journalistic instincts having uncovered information that explained the sudden reversal. Commander Mitchell wasn't the only military connection they tried to use, Maria explained. Robert Mitchell contacted 3 different Pentagon offices, 2 congressional committees, and a defense intelligence agency, all claiming that your family represented a security threat. Jake was amazed by the scope of the campaign that had been mounted against his family. "How did you find all this out?" "Freedom of Information Act requests," Maria replied with satisfaction. "Plus some sources I've developed through my internship at the Tribune. When military families get attacked, people notice." She showed Jake copies of official correspondence that revealed the full extent of Robert Mitchell's efforts to destroy Jake's family. The documents painted a picture of a man who'd become so obsessed with protecting his son's reputation that he'd been willing to attack a Medal of Honor recipient's family. "The best part," Maria continued, "is that Commander Mitchell made sure copies of all this documentation reached the right people in Washington. Robert Mitchell is about to discover that attacking military families has consequences he never imagined." The final chapter of Jake's story at Lincoln High began the following week when he was called to Principal Hayes' office for what he expected to be another administrative meeting. Instead, he found the office filled with people he recognized as military personnel, including several officers whose rank insignia indicated very senior positions. At the center of the group stood a man Jake had never seen before, but whose bearing and decorations immediately commanded respect. Admiral James Harrison, according to his name tag, was apparently the senior Navy representative for the Western United States. "Mr. Thompson," Admiral Harrison said as Jake entered the office, "it's an honor to meet the son of Master Chief Thompson. Your father's service to this country has been exceptional." Jake felt overwhelmed by the presence of so much senior military leadership in his high school principal's office. "Thank you, sir. We're here today," Admiral Harrison continued, "because what happened to your family represents exactly the kind of civilian interference in military affairs that we cannot tolerate." Principal Hayes looked nervous as she tried to understand her role in what was clearly a much larger situation than she'd realized. "Admiral, if there's anything the school can do to support Mr. Thompson." "Actually," Admiral Harrison replied, "there is. We'd like Mr. Thompson to share his story with other military families who might face similar situations." His response to bullying, while unfortunate in its viral nature, demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and restraint we try to instill in military children. The meeting continued for an hour, covering everything from Jake's future educational plans to the security lessons learned from the viral video incident. But the underlying message was clear. Jake's family was under the protection of the United States Navy, and anyone who tried to harm them would face consequences far beyond what civilian authorities could impose. As the military personnel prepared to leave, Admiral Harrison pulled Jake aside for a private conversation. "Your father wanted me to give you a message," he said. "He's proud of how you handled yourself, both in the original confrontation and in the aftermath." Jake felt emotion building in his chest as he thought about his father's reaction to everything that had happened. Is he safe? His mission, I mean. Admiral Harrison smiled slightly. "Your father is exactly where he needs to be, doing exactly what he's trained to do." The security review confirmed that no operational details were compromised by the video. If anything, the incident demonstrated that military families know how to handle themselves under pressure. The transformation of Lincoln High School in the wake of Jake's story was profound and lasting. The viral video had sparked conversations about bullying, privilege, and accountability that extended far beyond the campus boundaries. Dark Mitchell's departure had created a power vacuum that was filled by students who'd previously been marginalized or intimidated. The ROTC program experienced a surge in enrollment as students became interested in learning the kind of discipline and skills that Jake had demonstrated. Coach Williams was promoted to athletic director with a mandate to create programs that emphasized character development alongside physical achievement. Most importantly, the school implemented new policies specifically designed to protect military families and other vulnerable populations from the kind of systematic harassment that Derek had practiced. Jake's story became a case study in how institutions could either enable abuse or stand up for their most vulnerable members. 6 months after the incident that changed everything, Jake stood on the same football field where he'd first revealed his capabilities to Dark Mitchell and his crew. But this time, he wasn't alone. Dozens of students had joined him for the inaugural meeting of the Lincoln High Military Family Support Group, an organization that Jake had helped establish to ensure that other military kids would never face the isolation he'd experienced. Maria Santos, now the editor of the school newspaper, was documenting the meeting for a follow-up story about the long-term impacts of Jake's viral moment. "Any regrets?" she asked as they watched younger students practicing the conflict resolution techniques that Coach Williams had integrated into the PIA curriculum. Jake considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret that it took a viral video to make people pay attention to bullying. I regret that my family had to go through the stress of a federal investigation. But I don't regret standing up for myself and showing other kids that they don't have to accept abuse." The support group meeting featured presentations from current and former military personnel who shared their experiences with frequent moves, deployment stress, and the challenges of maintaining family connections across distances and time zones. Jake found himself serving as a peer counselor for younger students who were struggling with the same issues he'd faced. One freshman, whose father was deployed with the Air Force, approached Jake after the meeting with a question that brought everything full circle. "What do you do when someone bigger and stronger is picking on you, but fighting back? Will just make things worse?" Jake thought about his father's training, about the techniques that had served him so well against Derek's crew, but also about the broader lessons of the past 6 months. "You find your allies," he said finally. "You document what's happening. You use the systems that are in place to protect you. And if all else fails, you defend yourself with exactly the amount of force necessary to stay safe." The freshman nodded, seriously, clearly filing away the advice for future use. As Jake watched the boy walk away, he realized that his story had become bigger than just one confrontation between a military kid and a privileged bully. It had become a template for how young people could stand up to abuse while building the kind of community support that prevented future incidents. 2 years later, Jake Thompson graduated from Lincoln High School as valedictorian, with acceptances to multiple universities and a full ROTC scholarship to the Naval Academy. The viral video that had once threatened to destroy his family's security had instead become the foundation for a national conversation about bullying, privilege, and the unique challenges faced by military families. Dark Mitchell, meanwhile, had completed his program at the military academy where his parents had sent him, emerging as a changed young man who spent his gap year working with anti-bullying organizations and speaking to student groups about the consequences of unchecked privilege and aggression. The Mitchell family's business had survived the federal scrutiny, but Robert Mitchell had been forced to step down from several board positions and had become an unlikely advocate for military family support programs. His wife Linda had channeled her organizational skills into founding a scholarship program for children of deployed service members. Commander Sarah Mitchell had played a crucial role in orchestrating the family's rehabilitation, using her military connections to ensure that Robert's misguided campaign against Jake's family became a learning experience rather than a permanent black mark. Jake's father returned from his extended deployment 6 months before graduation, arriving home to find his son transformed from a quiet new kid into a confident young leader who'd learned to use his voice as effectively as his martial arts training. Master Chief Thompson attended every school event during his brief time home, his pride in Jake's accomplishments obvious to everyone who saw them together. The conversation about bullying that Jake's story had sparked extended far beyond Lincoln High School. Military installations across the country implemented new support programs for families dealing with frequent relocations and deployment stress. Civilian schools developed protocols for identifying and supporting military students who might be vulnerable to harassment. Most importantly, the viral video had demonstrated that young people didn't have to accept abuse from those who held social or economic power over them. Jake's precise and controlled response to Derek's aggression had become a symbol of how victims could transform themselves into advocates without resorting to the same tactics used by their tormentors. On graduation day, as Jake walked across the stage to receive his diploma, he caught sight of Maria Santos in the audience, now preparing for her own journalism program at Northwestern University. She gave him a thumbs up and mouthed the words Pulitzer Prize, referring to the investigative series she'd written about military family challenges that had been picked up by national publications. Coach Williams, now Dr. Williams after completing his education doctorate, presented Jake with a special recognition for leadership and community service. The former Marine's pride in his students' accomplishments was evident as he shook Jake's hand and offered a final piece of advice. Remember, son, the real test of a warrior isn't how well they fight, but how well they build peace after the fighting is done. As Jake looked out at the audience filled with military families, civilian supporters, and fellow students who'd been inspired by his example, he realized that his father's training had prepared him for far more than physical confrontations. The techniques that had enabled him to defeat Derek's crew in 15 seconds had also given him the confidence to build bridges, create communities, and transform a moment of violence into years of positive change. The quiet military kid who just wanted to finish high school in peace had instead become a catalyst for conversations about justice, courage, and the responsibility that came with both privilege and power. Jake Thompson's story would continue long after he left Lincoln High, inspiring other young people to stand up for themselves and others, while building the kind of communities where bullying couldn't survive. The viral video that had once threatened everything Jake's family held dear had ultimately become the foundation for a legacy of positive change that would impact military families and civilian communities for generations to come. Sometimes the most important battles were won not through superior force, but through the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the cost seemed impossibly high. 5 years after the incident that transformed Lincoln High School, Jake Thompson stood on the deck of a Navy destroyer cutting through Pacific waters, his ensign's bars gleaming in the morning sun. The Naval Academy had shaped him into the officer his father had always believed he could become. But the lessons learned on a California football field remained the foundation of his leadership philosophy. The ship's communications officer approached with a tablet displaying news feeds from around the world. "Sir, you might want to see this," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of respect and curiosity. "It's about your old high school." Jake accepted the device and found himself looking at a CNN report about Lincoln High School receiving a national award for its anti-bullying programs and military family support initiatives. The footage showed students from dozens of countries participating in a global conference on school safety, with Lincoln High serving as the model for institutional change. Principal Martinez, who had replaced Dr. Hayes 3 years earlier, was being interviewed about the school's transformation. The incident with Jake Thompson in 2025 was a wake-up call for our entire educational system. She explained to the reporter, "We realized that we weren't just failing to protect vulnerable students. We were actively enabling a culture that celebrated aggression and privilege over character and integrity." The report included updated footage of the school's current programs, peer mediation councils, military family liaison officers, anonymous reporting systems, and most significantly, mandatory character development courses that had been adopted by school districts across the nation. The quiet military kid's 15-second response to bullying had ultimately influenced educational policy at the federal level. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message from Maria Santos, now a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist whose series on institutional bullying had sparked congressional hearings and legislative reforms. Watching the CNN piece about Lincoln, "Remember when we thought this was just a local story? You've created a movement that's bigger than any of us imagined." The irony wasn't lost on Jake that his attempt to remain invisible had instead made him one of the most influential advocates for military families and bullying victims in American history. The viral video that had once threatened his family's security had become required viewing in military family orientation programs and civilian sensitivity training courses. As the destroyer continued its patrol through international waters, Jake reflected on the complex chain of events that had led from a high school confrontation to a global conversation about power, privilege, and accountability. The techniques his father had taught him for physical self-defense had ultimately proven less important than the lessons about moral courage and community building that had emerged from the aftermath. His laptop contained dozens of messages from students around the world who had used his story as inspiration for their own stands against injustice. A girl in rural Alabama had successfully challenged a pattern of sexual harassment by football players. A military kid in Germany had organized international students to support each other through deployment stress. A scholarship student in Connecticut had exposed a culture of economic discrimination at an elite private school. Each story reinforced Jake's understanding that his viral moment had tapped into something much larger than one confrontation between a military kid and a privileged bully. It had revealed the universal human need for dignity, respect, and the courage to stand up for others when institutions failed to protect the vulnerable. The ship's captain, a career Navy officer who had served alongside Jake's father during multiple deployments, joined him at the rail. Captain Rodriguez had been following Jake's career with interest, recognizing in the young ensign the same combination of tactical skill and moral clarity that made Master Chief Thompson legendary within the SEAL community. "Thompson, Captain," Rodriguez said, "you've got a message from Naval Special Warfare Command. They're requesting your transfer to a new program." Jake accepted the encrypted communication device and read the orders that would change his life again. The Navy was establishing a new unit focused on protecting military families from domestic threats, ranging from cyberbullying to economic discrimination to political harassment. They wanted Jake to help design and lead the program, drawing on his unique experience as both a military child and a symbol of resistance against institutional abuse. The assignment would take him back to California, where he would work with a team of psychologists, legal experts, and communication specialists to develop comprehensive support systems for military families facing civilian hostility. The program would address everything from social media harassment to employment discrimination to educational challenges faced by frequently relocating families. As Jake prepared his response to Naval Special Warfare Command, his mind returned to that October afternoon when Derek Mitchell had made the mistake of threatening his family. The 15 seconds of violence that followed had been the least important part of the story. The real transformation had occurred in the weeks and months afterward, as individuals and institutions chose to either perpetuate cycles of abuse or work toward systemic change. Derek Mitchell himself had become an unexpected ally in the broader movement Jake's story had inspired. After completing his military academy program, Derek had spent 2 years working with restorative justice organizations, speaking to student groups about the psychology of bullying and the importance of accountability. His transformation from privileged aggressor to thoughtful advocate had become almost as influential as Jake's original story. The Mitchell family's experience had also contributed to important conversations about wealth, privilege, and responsibility. Robert Mitchell's initial campaign against Jake's family had ultimately led to congressional hearings about the influence of defense contractors on federal agencies. The hearings had resulted in new oversight mechanisms and transparency requirements that made it much more difficult for wealthy civilians to weaponize government institutions for personal vendettas. Commander Sarah Mitchell, Derek's aunt, had leveraged the family's notoriety into a successful advocacy career, using her military credentials and family experience to bridge the gap between civilian communities and military families. Her work had led to new federal protections for military children and spouses facing discrimination based on their family members' service. Jake's mother, Sarah Thompson, had become a national spokesperson for military spouses, using her nursing background and personal experience to highlight the unique challenges faced by families dealing with frequent relocations, deployment stress, and security concerns. Her testimony before Congress had led to expanded healthcare access and educational support programs for military dependents. Most importantly, Master Chief Thompson had returned from his extended deployment to find his son transformed from a teenager struggling with invisibility into a young man who understood the power of his voice and the responsibility that came with influence. The father's pride in his son's character development was evident to everyone who saw them together during Jake's brief leaves from naval service. The destroyer's mission took them past the coordinates where Jake's father had conducted some of his most dangerous operations, classified missions that would never be publicly acknowledged, but had protected American lives and interests around the world. Jake understood now that his own mission was equally important, though very different in scope and methodology. Protecting military families from domestic threats required the same kind of strategic thinking and tactical precision that his father employed in overseas operations. The enemies were different: institutional indifference, social prejudice, economic discrimination, but the stakes were equally high for the families caught in the crossfire. Jake's laptop contained detailed plans for the new Naval Special Warfare Program, including training protocols for family liaison officers, rapid response systems for harassment incidents, and communication strategies for managing viral social media events. The irony that his own viral moment had provided the template for managing similar situations wasn't lost on him. The program would also include partnerships with civilian institutions, helping schools, employers, and community organizations develop better support systems for military families. Jake's experience at Lincoln High had demonstrated that positive change was possible when leadership was willing to acknowledge problems and implement solutions, but it required sustained effort and community commitment. 3 months later, Jake found himself back in Riverside, California, standing in the same gymnasium where Coach Williams had first recognized his potential for leadership. The school had invited him to speak at a ceremony marking the 5th anniversary of the anti-bullying programs that had emerged from his story. The gymnasium was packed with students, teachers, parents, and military personnel from nearby bases. Maria Santos was there to document the event for a documentary series about social change in American education. Derek Mitchell sat in the front row, his military academy uniform, a visible symbol of his own transformation and commitment to positive change. Jake approached the podium with the same controlled confidence he'd developed during his Naval Academy years, but his message was deeply personal and rooted in the experiences that had shaped his understanding of courage, community, and accountability. 5 years ago, Jake began, I was a scared kid who just wanted to get through high school without causing problems for my family. I thought courage meant staying invisible, avoiding conflict, and hoping that graduation would come quickly enough to escape the attention of people who seemed determined to make my life difficult. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word from the young man whose story had become legendary within their community. I learned that day on the football field that sometimes staying invisible isn't an option, Jake continued. Sometimes you have to stand up not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. The techniques my father taught me ended the immediate threat in 15 seconds, but the real work of building a safer community took years of sustained effort by hundreds of people. Jake's speech outlined the lessons he'd learned about institutional change, community building, and the responsibility that came with influence. He spoke about the importance of documentation, the power of allies, and the need for systemic solutions to problems that often appeared to be individual conflicts. But his most important message was about the difference between victory and success. Winning a fight is about defeating your opponent, he explained. Success is about creating a world where such fights become unnecessary. The real victory here isn't that I was able to defend myself against Derek and his friends. The real victory is that students today have systems in place that make it much less likely they'll ever face similar situations. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of the first annual Jake Thompson Award for Student Leadership, recognizing a Lincoln High student who had demonstrated exceptional courage in standing up for others. The recipient was a sophomore named David Park, whose documentation of harassment against special needs students had led to additional policy changes and training programs. As Jake watched David accept the award with obvious nervousness and pride, he was reminded of his own transformation from invisible new kid to reluctant public figure to committed advocate. The cycle of positive change was continuing with a new generation of students who understood that they had both the power and the responsibility to protect each other. After the ceremony, Jake walked through the halls of Lincoln High with Principal Martinez, observing the subtle but significant changes that had transformed the school's culture. Anti-bullying posters created by students lined the walls, featuring quotes from diverse voices including his own viral moment. Peer mediation rooms provided safe spaces for conflict resolution. Military family liaison offices offered specialized support for the unique challenges faced by frequently relocating students. Most importantly, the social dynamics that had once elevated students like Derek Mitchell to positions of unchecked power had been replaced by leadership structures that rewarded character, inclusivity, and service to others. The football team, once a symbol of privileged aggression, now participated in community service projects and peer mentoring programs. The changes go beyond policy, Principal Martinez explained as they toured the updated facilities. The student culture itself has shifted toward supporting each other rather than establishing dominance hierarchies. Your story gave them permission to imagine a different way of interacting. Jake's phone buzzed with a message from his father, who was currently deployed somewhere in the Middle East, but had been following the ceremony through live streaming. Proud of you, son. You've learned that the most important battles are fought with courage, not violence. The warrior who creates peace is more valuable than the one who wins wars. The message reinforced Jake's understanding that his father's training had prepared him for far more than physical confrontations. The discipline, strategic thinking, and moral clarity that characterized Navy SEAL operations were equally applicable to the work of social change and community building. That evening, Jake attended a reunion dinner with the core group of people who had supported him during the original crisis. Maria Santos had flown in from Washington, where she was covering national politics for the Post. Coach Williams, now Dr. Williams and serving as superintendent of a neighboring school district, brought updates on the regional expansion of Lincoln High's programs. Even Derek Mitchell joined them, his presence a powerful symbol of redemption and the possibility of genuine change. The former bully had become one of the most effective advocates for restorative justice approaches to school discipline, using his own experience to help other students understand the long-term consequences of aggressive behavior. "I used to think power meant making other people afraid of you," Derek reflected during dinner. "Jake taught me that real power comes from making other people feel safer because you're there." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering everything from the global expansion of anti-bullying programs to the political challenges of implementing systemic change in resistant institutions. Jake found himself serving as both a symbol of the movement and a practical strategist for its continued growth. As the reunion concluded, Maria Santos pulled Jake aside for a final interview that would serve as the conclusion to her documentary series. "Looking back, do you think that 15-second confrontation was worth all the consequences that followed?" Jake considered the question carefully, thinking about the federal investigations, the media attention, the family stress, and the years of advocacy work that had emerged from his moment of self-defense. "The confrontation itself was necessary," he said finally. Derek and his crew weren't going to stop their harassment without consequences. But the real value came from what happened afterward, when people chose to use that moment as a catalyst for broader change instead of just another viral video to forget about after a few weeks. Maria nodded, her journalist's instincts recognizing the deeper truth in Jake's response. "Your story has become a template for how individual acts of courage can inspire institutional transformation. Do you think other students can replicate that kind of impact?" "I think every student has the potential to create positive change," Jake replied. "They don't need to know martial arts or have military training. They just need to understand that they have a voice, allies who will support them, and systems they can use to address problems before they escalate to violence." 6 months later, Ensign Jake Thompson reported to his new assignment at Naval Special Warfare Command, where he would spend the next 3 years developing and implementing the military family protection program he had helped design. The work would take him to bases around the world, training personnel to recognize and respond to threats against military families, while building partnerships with civilian institutions. His first assignment was particularly meaningful, developing a comprehensive response protocol for viral social media incidents involving military children. The program would provide immediate support for families dealing with unwanted attention, while leveraging positive viral moments to advance broader policy goals. Jake's own experience had taught him that viral videos could be devastating for the families involved, but they could also serve as powerful catalysts for conversations that might otherwise never happen. The key was having systems in place to manage the immediate crisis while channeling the attention toward sustainable change. The program's success was measured not just in reduced harassment incidents, but in increased reporting of problems, improved support services, and stronger partnerships between military and civilian communities. Jake's story had provided the template, but the real work required thousands of people across multiple institutions working together toward common goals. As Jake settled into his new role, he received a letter from a military child stationed in Japan whose family had successfully used the protocols Jake had developed to address harassment at their local school. The letter reminded him that his story had become bigger than any individual incident. inspiring a global network of advocates working to protect vulnerable populations from institutional abuse. The quiet military kid who had just wanted to graduate in peace had instead become a catalyst for worldwide conversations about courage, community, and the responsibility that came with privilege and power. His 15-second response to bullying had ultimately created ripple effects that would protect military families for generations to come. Jake Thompson's legacy wasn't defined by his ability to defeat Derek Mitchell's crew in physical combat, but by his commitment to building systems that made such confrontations unnecessary. The real victory belonged not to any individual warrior, but to the communities that chose justice over convenience, inclusion over hierarchy, and sustained effort over viral moments. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.